Okay, when we started out this class, I talked a little bit about how the big problem in some sense is how we are able to use these strings of sounds and to get from sounds to meaning. And the job of a theory of syntax is to explain the part whereby the ordering of words into phrases and the ordering of phrases into sentences and the structures inside of those things makes it such that we're able to get the meaning. And we looked at different ways of doing this, and we in some sense it's about the structures, the syntactic structures, but it ends up being really all about meaning, because what we end up saying in the long run is that when we get the structures of sentences, when we've got that figured out, we've also got the meaning figured out, because it turns out that the syntactic structures are really just webs of complete little webs of meaning is what they are, right? And the patterns that we see are patterns not just concerning nouns and verbs and things categorized that way, but they're actually the patterns that matter for interpreting the sentences. So what we end up with is sentence structures that are themselves complete little webs of meaning. Now, obviously, we're abstracting away from certain things and really only focusing on the verb meanings and maybe some other parts, right? So we're when we do that by having things like Kramer and Elaine, where we don't have to worry about the internal structure of those things. But the internal structure of DPs will also turn out to be the same thing. It's organized around a set of principles, around a set of syntactic principles, and it's really our knowing what those syntactic principles are that makes it possible for us to do this incredible thing, which is to take these strings of sound and from a very early age to be able to extract the meaning from those, because everything about it, everything about language adds up to spelling out the entire puzzle, the entire web of meaning. So we looked last time at, and so what I'm going to just end this class with looking at some classic problems in English that we're able to really give some interesting answers to once we have this all figured out. So we've gone through this exercise of looking at how you might develop a theory of syntax, how you might describe the structures of sentences, and how you might develop hypotheses and test them, and use empirical evidence, so science, in order to make decisions about these things. And so we've sort of done this collaboratively to some extent, where we've had the homeworks having you look into the questions and give you parts of the answers, and then and it sort of all kind of adds up at the end. So want is a really interesting verb, very, very common verb, that one of the most frequent verbs of the language, and it has really interesting properties about what goes with it. Its complement structure. At first, you think, well, want, that's pretty simple, right? I want another glass of water or whatever, right? Really simple stuff, but it turns out that it's not so simple. And you can do all kinds of things you want. I want to do something. I want you to do something. I want Elaine. I want Elaine to be near me. I want Elaine near me. All of that stuff, we have all of those different possibilities, and they're all really at some level reducible to a small range of actual structure. And we can do that by virtue of our knowledge of, or I guess what it is our ability to fill in the missing pieces. We know when we say, I want Elaine near me, we know that means I want Elaine to be near me, because that's part of it is our knowledge of the preposition near and prepositions in general, and so forth. So the Elaine is an argument of near, is what we want to end up saying in this theory, and therefore this structure has to be like this. And we want Elaine to be an argument of near, and it is, right, because that's where it starts out. So we can have movement of things, but where they start out is critical. And you can have a PP near itself has two arguments. Typically, you don't see them there because other parts of the syntax conspire to disallow that, to disallow prepositional phrases from having both of their arguments inside of them. They don't want that for whatever reason, but it's not just that they don't want that. The entire structure seems to force it. But we get the right result with respect to anaphora here. We get an account of why we have to have him and not himself by having that that idea. Near has two arguments displayed in the syntactic structure. So so Kramer is not a co-argument of that DP position, and therefore you don't have himself, you have him instead. So that licenses him and disallows himself. Now, of course, it's not maybe totally impossible to put himself there, right? But it's weird, and if it is possible, it's by virtue of the fact that himself can sometimes just have point of view. It's looking for its co-argument binder, but there are cases where it doesn't need that, and it looks for the point of view thing. And Kramer's point of view is what's at issue here. So that could make it so that you might put Kramer in there at some. It wouldn't be so bad, right? So if you have that kind of intuition, and so we have an account for the whole thing, right? And then the Elaine raises to that position really because B is a raising verb. B doesn't itself have, it allows, maybe it's both. It could be either a raising or a control verb, but it can be just a raising verb. And we know that because of things like, I don't want there to be a problem, or something like that with this, right? So why can there be the subject of be? Because there is not itself a semantically meaningful element, right? It's not occupying an argument node. So be is a raising, but also want is a raising to object verb, right? It wants to have something. It wants to have an object in that position, and that's the characteristic object position. Now, what we're seeing is direct object of verb is really not the sister of the verb often. It's the complement. It's the specifier of the complement of the verb. So this is all. So everything is conspiring to give us the result that we want, and then we find supporting evidence, right? So we look at quantifier flow, and we see that it just seems fine to have. Kramer doesn't want both of them. Oh, I have angry at him. Yeah, this was it would work with angry at him, but near him, and Kramer doesn't want them both near him. Both of them are perfectly good. Our structure allows for that possibility of having both after them by virtue of, right? So we start out with both of them. The them part raises, and then you're left with just both in that position. Okay, so lots of things all add up to the same thing, but this is actually even way more interesting. It turns out that if you just keep following, just keep going down this path, you end up with an interesting result for just ordinary run-of-the-mill sentences with, question? Yeah.
I don't know if I'm reading stories, but are we saying that verbs, even when they're in the slot, they retain they retain their characteristics, right? I mean,
it's just that everything sort of adds up to Elaine being in that slot, and that's consistent with B being a raising verb, right? Is that what you're asking, right? Well, everything should add up, right? They should be being like they are, right? Just like we say that should be being like they are. Can I say that? Well, why? Because B wants to have, that's not copular B. it's the one that is the auxiliary that's asking for ing form, right? And we're saying, well, when you have this and you have a VP under it, then, and a V, the V is going to be in the ing form, right? That's a property of auxiliary B, right? This one here, though, is copular B, the one that's asking for a prepositional phrase or a locative phrase or an adjective, right? An adjective will work here, right? Kramer doesn't want Elaine angry at him. It's fine as well, right? Same as Kramer doesn't want Elaine to be angry at him, right? So yeah, everything is consistent. In general, right? I mean, obviously, all stories are gonna fail at some point. They're not gonna get everything, right? But yeah, in general, that's what we want. That's what we want to see, right? Okay, so this one, it turns out that the way something like this is what we want as the analysis, because it turns out that want, just regular old DP, seems to have all the properties of want to have DP. Just like the other one has want to be, where it's something else, right? And so it seems like we have another kind of structure like this with a covert have. And then if we do that, have a girlfriend, then the subject of that have has to be an empty subject, right? Because you can't say things like, Kramer doesn't want Elaine have a boyfriend, right? If you make it over, you have to put it in the to, right? Doesn't want, but you can do that, right? Doesn't want Elaine to have a boyfriend. Perfectly fine, right? So again, we just take a shortcut. This is a kind of common thing, and want then turns out to really be always wanting. It's not true. Want can have just an ordinary DP. Want actually turns out to just like always want a clause. But it could be any kind of clause. A regular, except it can't be a CP, right? In English. It can be in Spanish, right? But in English, you can't say, I want that you do that, right? No. English doesn't care. English wants to have some kind of non-tensed. Want just wants a non-tensed clause, and it can be a small clause. And it can be a small clause like this, where it has a pro subject that is necessarily the same as Kramer, right? Okay, yeah, it can have it doesn't want a tensed. And by the way, there are some people that would analyze, I just don't see the evidence, but I don't want to have a girlfriend. Kramer doesn't want to have a girlfriend with a to have in it. Some people claim that that's a CP. But there's a bunch of, there's a null C, right? Because you can say I want for. So maybe that's the case, right? Maybe in that case you do. It's kind of, but to me it seems like a small question. Right? So I haven't done that, but could be right. I don't see why you would want it to be that way, but there might be reasons. But in any case, it's sort of more interesting that you can have a pro subject without even any to around and without any verb around, and just an ordinary DP. So that's kind of an interesting result. And then we see that there are the reasons for doing that are the standard kind of things that we can look at for evidence, right? I think that's right. That Kramer doesn't. This is the argument that was given in the most recent paper that I know of that examined this. Kramer right now, maybe for the first time, doesn't want that job he had before. There's a possible reading of Kramer doesn't want that job again, right? But that's where the again would be there. But it's also possible to have the repetitive reading. Kramer doesn't want a job, doesn't want that job again. Kramer doesn't want that job again. Could be, again, he doesn't want that job again, right? So again, can have scope over both of those things, and that's possible by virtue of us having structure in which we can put those things in different places. Okay, so then now let's look at, we want to end up with Actually, I mean, we're doing a lot here, right? But we've done all the groundwork. We're gonna see solution to two of the biggest problems or areas of inquiry in the syntax of English and in the syntax of lots of other languages as well, because lots of languages have the same kinds of things. So the double object construction versus the one that's not double object, right? We've looked at this from various perspectives, but now we have a kind of full story that's going to make some sense. And also something that we really haven't talked about is the verb particle construction in English, which is also, again, something that's been, both of these things have been on the agenda ever since Chomsky first started to look at them in 1957 and published Syntactic Structures, where the book that got linguistics on the map in the sciences in general, in some sense, right? And still, there are mysteries about these things, and I don't have solutions to all of these things. There have been people, though, looking at them for a long time, and we've built up a kind of structure that allows us to give some, at least to begin to see some interesting answers. So we can gave her brother a present, where all of these things are going to have the same basic structure, right? So what this means is that two objects next to each other means structure like this, with meanings like this. And the things that differ we're not showing here, but we probably could. But we have things like, Elaine sent her brother a present, would have the same basic structure, but there's some extra meaning that send has that give doesn't, right? Send has this stuff about, and it's part of what our knowledge of the complete meaning of the verbs are, is that send has something about they're having to be a traversal of space through mail or something, right? And that's what send means. And we could throw that into the tree, but it'd be a lot of work. And bought would have something to do with buying, right? There'd be exchange of money and other things that are, but it's the same across a wide range. This double object construction is going to have the same skeletal meaning. It's the claim where there's going to be a do, a cause, and some kind of have structure underneath there that can be described this way. And the first object will be the recipient by virtue of the structure and the meaning, because that thing, her brother there, starts out as the subject of have. The subject of have is just like Tom has money, right? Then you add on to that something, somebody makes that happen. Then you have the concept of a recipient, someone that comes to have money because there has to be a time interval over which this takes place, right? Okay, so we have a bunch of things, and we even can I don't see any reason, not to have essentially the same structure for show her brother a picture. Notice that there isn't really a transfer of possession, right? It's different than send and give, buy, and stuff where you buy somebody something, they come to have it. This really means they come to, you do something such that the person that you're the recipient comes to see something, right? But coming to see something is, maybe just throw in see instead of have there, right? But see is kind of like having something. It's having something in your perceptual field or your perceptual cognition. All right, so it sort of all makes sense, but then we can we can then handle all kinds of things with more or less the same sort of structure. So Kramer put new tires on the car would be, actually, it's a bunch of stuff here, right? But it's all kind of the same thing. He caused tires to be on the car. If Kramer put two tires on the car, that's what he did, right? You could put become instead of be, it kind of doesn't really matter. But be is good enough in a sense, right? If he caused something to be somewhere, then you can compute from that there was a change of location. And that would be a natural consequence of this, right? So an amalgam of do, cause, and be, at, on, and you can have a variety of different things there depending on whatever situation you want. And then we get the same kinds of evidence. Kramer put both of them on the same car. Kramer put them both on the same car. We can do that by virtue of having a structure where there are two different DP slots, right? So this is going to be the norm, the direct object of a sentence. Any kind of sentence with complex semantics like this, where there's a change going on of some kind, will have the possibility of the object being in two DP slots, right, occupying both. It's both the subject of the preposition, as prepositional phrase. The tires at the end of the day are on the car, right? Tires are on the car. Are is only there because of a part of the grammar of English that says, make me, gotta have something. You have to have a shell. You have to have either an IP shell or a DP shell or whatever, right? And B has to be in there somehow or other. Okay, and that part of it here, this DP part, is motivated by other structures where you kind of can't say anything else, right? There's got to be, right? This is just the same thing as with new tires on the car, right? Where new tires is the subject of a DP, where end of the PP on the car, there's nothing else there, right? Here we have a little bit of a different story because we've got a verb above it, and we've got this story, this movement into the object of verb position that happens all over the place. And then Kramer put those memories behind himself again, because we've got structures like this where those memories in this case, right, is different. It's going to be the subject of a predicate behind him, and that's going to be a different sort of situation. Right? So that can be, in some cases, when those things are predicated, when there's a predication relationship between the preposition and the other thing, then you get binding domains defined by that. Okay, and there are cases where we probably want to have something like go rather than be in these structures. So Kramer shoved his clothes into the closet, caused his clothes to go into then there's some more meaning there. Shove means you have to at some point, somewhere that has to be given there, but that's what we can call for this do with shoving, right? We have to take some kind of shortcuts here because you probably don't, right? But the structure that you'd have to create would be very crazy, right? But you have a whole set of verbs like this, so push, drop, left, kept. And what preposition you'll have will depend on various factors and whether or not what will happen exactly will depend on various things, right? The nature of the preposition and so forth. You can also have presumably adjectives. Now, so we're going to take a new step here. We're going to allow ourselves, in some cases, to have. So actually, there's another thing we're going to do. We're going to account for another big problem. Called conversion, or there's different kinds of terminology. I think conversion is the most common one, where verbs turn into adjectives, and adjectives turn into verbs, and nouns turn into verbs, and so forth. We can actually, it turns out, handle a lot of that stuff in the syntax, given these sorts of structures. So suppose we want to say Kramer broke the window. If we decompose that, it would be Kramer did something to the window such that it became broken. So did something, the end result of that is that the window is broken. So we could just put put all of these things into the clause, right? Let's put broken there, right? And then we allow ourselves the possibility of just use head-to-head movement, right? So we have Kramer, we put it up here and put it in the verb slot. Because of that, it turns into a verb, and then it moves up, just moves up. The general rule is going to be, because all we have, just have the principles. Head-to-head movement. You can move from one head position to the head position of the next higher level, as long as there's nothing preventing you from doing that. And and critically, of course, having these semantic elements without phonological content associated with this nose is not preventing you from being moved into. They're inviting you to be moved into. And we need to get something up in that topmost little v node anyway, right? So we just move it up and do all the stuff we need to do, and we end up with broke is the spell out of do something causing something to be broken. That's what broke means. That's what it is. It's got all of the stuff that's in the structure of this sort. And of course, the window starts out as then in this scenario as the subject of broken. Subject of broken. It's an argument of broken, right? That's the right result. Broken is something that's being predicated of the window. And it raises up into the positions it does because that's the system, right? B allows raising to its subject position. All do allows raising to the specifier of its VP if it's empty already. And so, all of it is part of the ordinary thing. So we saw how you get the double object construction. And the double object, what's interesting, or one of the things that's interesting about it is that, so you can have Kramer sent the president letters. He sent the president the letters, or he sent the letters to the president. So those are different. Why do we have different structures? Well, and they have different properties, it turns out, if you look at them more closely. There are all kinds of things in this sort of what was called the alternation. The double object alternation is this, right? You can have it with a preposition to or without the preposition. And so forth. Under this story, we kind of want to have an analysis of why there's a to there as part of it, right? And why it has to be to. It's not like you get a choice among prepositions. Notice how this is different than put. Put says, I put the books on the table into the glove compartment behind me on top of the shelf. You put a lot of different prepositional phrase structures with put because put isn't really demanding anything, right? I just want a locational PP. But here we've got a situation where we have a kind of different situation, and this is going to look kind of weird, right? But let's just be a little bit imaginative. Let's suppose, because we're going to say that you have to do this anyway, that you can independently of this, although this one isn't working like that, right? Let's say that you can have such a thing as a VP compound, a verb together with a preposition. And didn't we say that that's what you do with end up and so forth, right? End up just like a verb. And I just treat it like a verb and no one had any problems with that, right? So let's say that's something that you could do all over the place. And in fact, nothing prevents you from having that be the verb being part of a P thing, right? The whole thing makes a P, not a V. Why not, right? A V plus P makes a V. How about a V plus a P makes a P? And that P can have an argument. It can have arguments and so forth, right? And so we could do it like this, right? But we're going to say that this is different, right? This is a functional rather than predicative P. It's not predicating anything of anything, right? It's the go-to is, right? But the go part, right? This is kind of critical, right? The go part is part of the entire verb, such that the arguments of send will be the president, the letters, and Kramer, all of those, the co-arguments in terms of the syntax, right? So we're doing a kind of interesting trick here that will help us with things, right? So, and this would work for return, through, show, gave, all of those, they have a to. Why do they have a to? And why does it have to be to? Because we've got something like this here. And then it makes sense, right? And then, well, why do we have two different structures? Because we kind of have different meanings. I sent the letters to the president. I made the letters go to the president via mail, right? I made it so that the president had the letters via mail, right? Kind of end up with, at the end of the day, the same meaning, but from different routes. And so it's not like an arbitrary thing then. Okay, so Kramer sent the letters, then we get to himself, not him, right? Why is that? Because, as I said, go and cause and do, all of those, because the go there, notice that the verb go, I didn't show this, right? But that little V go there raises up to the V position above it, head-to-head movement, and then raises all the way up to the top. So it's in those situations where the verb is unpacked itself all over the clause and in all of the slots where there are arguments, that you've just got one verb that is predicating of all jointly, right? It's send means do, cause, go, and that amalgam of meaning elements has three arguments. So we get the right result. Three arguments, nothing. We get the right results for the anaphora, single VP shell defining a co-argument domain for for purposes of binding theory, for all of the pieces in it. So that's interesting, right? Because we get to have, once we start putting in the meaning elements here and allowing ourselves to see these things like VP compounding, then we can have stories for lots of stuff that otherwise are kind of mysterious, right? And so another kind of thing that we could do is noun incorporation. That would give us, basically, that's going to give us noun to V conversion that happens all over the place. We might not be able to account for everything this way, but probably we can, right? So Kevin did something causing the fish not to have guts. Kevin gutted the fish. So let's put guts down where it belongs, right? And then it undergoes, and then we have, not have, we'll make it be a P, right? And we'll have gut incorporate into that and take on that role, but it's going to have to move up bare end with no licensing. D, can there's some kind of principle, and we get noun to V conversion, right? With nothing but then here what do we have? A VP compound. And that's something that we're going to have all over the place. That's something that's part of the really basic structure of English. It's how you make verbs. It's what you do. And to make new verbs in English, what our favorite pattern is to take a verb and add a P to it. And you've got a new verb. Look up, mess up. You can take the verb, take out, there's all kinds of things like that. I mean, the ones that come to mind, unfortunately, are, F words, but, F over, F up. Just give me a preposition with F and we're okay almost, right? With some new meaning, right? We need verbs for new meanings, we just do it that way. So then we move the V up here, and then all the way up, and we get, I guess I didn't, but you get the idea. Got the fish. And we could do it with, here's paint. Elaine painted the house, caused the house to have paint on it, right? You probably would want a more elaborate structure, or you might want cause the paint to maybe it's cause the paint to go on. I don't know. You could work it out. This was by the way, this stuff, the noun to verb conversion, was the basis, the main basis for one of the key pieces of literature where this VP shell stuff was proposed originally by Ken Hale, and I showed you a reference in an earlier slide somewhere. Ken Hale and Samuel Kaiser at MIT. So we end up with, we do all this stuff. We end up with Elaine painted the house, right? Where it's got to have the past tense. I haven't showed you how to do this, but we don't want that verb to go up to I, because we know it doesn't. It doesn't have the properties of an auxiliary. Only auxiliaries will do certain things, or main verbs don't go up there. So there has to be a rule for saying that past tense. But if we're going to say tense is always in that I node, there's a rule that Chomsky originally called affix hopping. Move that past tense down onto that verb if you have to. So I'm just going to ignore that. I've been ignoring that because it's really kind of a not very pretty rule. But anyway, you can do this with all kinds of verbs. Nouns can be converted into verbs like this, right? Cover, fence, blanket. I want you to blanket that with something. Sometimes you'd have to add the other things that have to go on. Okay, so here, finally, we'll look a little bit at the verb plus particle construction. And, we have a pretty crazy big story for it, but it's just nothing but adding up everything else that we've done. So the interesting thing about this is that, in general, you can have verb plus particle, where particle is this term they came up with because they said, well, we don't want to think of it as a preposition because prepositions are supposed to have a complement, they're supposed to have a DP with them and so forth, right? So we'll call it a particle. And what does that mean? Well, who knows? Particle just means, I don't know, we don't know how to categorize it. But these kinds of things are all categorically prepositions, as far as we can tell. And they're almost always locative prepositions. And those things behave in a really special way in the grammar. One of the things that's special about them is that they can either, when you have an object, let's say that, when you have an object, what we call the direct object, then they can either be on the verb or after the direct object and nowhere else. You cannot just float them around the clause, right? So Kramer put on his shoes yesterday, right? Kramer put his shoes on yesterday, fine, right? Kramer put his shoes yesterday on, no good, right? Because that's a really, really strong kind of constraint of the grammar of English, right? That there's this floating nature of these particle things, the prepositions, but they float only in very, very only in highly constrained ways. So our overall story is going to want to have an account of that, and it will, right? So his shoes is going to be way down there as a subject of the PP put on, and then there's this other interesting part here, put on, and there should be something there, right? But the interpretation of what the shoes are put on, you could have, right? Kramer put those shoes on his daughter. That's fine too, right? But then you don't float then the preposition is stuck there. It's got to stay there, can't go with the verb, right? So that would be a slightly different version of the same thing, right? Here the assumption is that the complement of put on is got to be something null, and it's got to be co-indexed with Kramer, and that's part of the grammar, right? Because that's the only interpretation. If we leave off the object of on, then the only interpretation is, oh, Kramer is, because this means Kramer put his shoes on himself, right? Necessarily the interpretation. So we're showing that with that pro in there. And so here we have a locative P with no covert complement, and it's a VP compound with both parts of it filled in. So we didn't see the both parts before filled in. We saw one of them being filled in, one of them being occupied only by one of these meaning primitives. But here, let's fill it in. That should be, all else being equal, that should be a possibility, right? And then we then can move it up into all of the, just because that's the way we do it, head-to-head movement. Keeps just moving up until it gets to the highest node, where we have Kramer put on his shoes, right? And we've got the right result. We've got this, actually, in fact, we can show that in this kind of a structure, when we have it like this, then put on actually behaves like a compound. It has the properties of a compound verb. Actually, the other thing that we want to have an account of is that no matter where we put the on, and the on can only go in certain places, it's going to be, you're not going to get a different meaning. And that's systematic across these verb particle constructions. There are some where you actually can't. You have to keep them separate. There's some where you have to keep them together, but those are rare. In most cases, you have the separability property, right? So you're with me here, right? We've got put on, we've got really a fairly straightforward. His shoes, of course, starts down as his shoes, put on, self, right? But his shoes has to raise, of course, for the reasons we've been talking about. That B is a raising verb, move up there. We want to get his shoes into the position of object of do at the topmost level. And then we can also just move the verb, because we already saw that you can do that. Verbs can move by themselves, leaves behind the preposition. This time before, we said, well, just move the verb. The semantic element in that compound stays behind. Right? Well, so is it? Are you laughing because this is crazy, or?
Just like it just seems like, I mean, I understand it. You're like round.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so this is the story that developed for these things in this particular syntactic theory, and other folks said had your reaction, said, dude, you got to be kidding me, right? Why would you ever do that, right? So I've done my best job here to kind of give you the without being neither a non-believer nor a believer, right? I'm open to almost anything, right? I'll take a look at it, right? And having really studied all of these things from the perspective of lots of different theories, right? I can see why you would say that. You would say, dude, why would you go there? So all I've been trying to do is give you the best story that could be given for why you might want to do this. And so if you kind of add up all these little pieces, some of which you don't really have all that good of evidence for, that's the hard part, right? Where you're going, well, yeah, I can see you've got some kind of argument there, but is it really a good, solid argument? And, I could take it apart, right? But so putting that all together, you end up, I'm just sort of amazed that you could end up here, starting out with the assumptions that you can, and having it all work and having it cohere, and having accounts for, reasonable accounts for basic things in the grammar of English that people have been worrying about for 40 years, and often coming up short on analysis. Now, I myself have published a paper on this stuff where I do it in a much more flat way without any movement, right? But there are virtues to this view. Yeah.
Final.
There's no. I don't really have an account of that, right? Why would that be, right? I mean, probably there's nothing really there, and the default is the default. I think I have a story about this. I have a story in the paper I published on this, right? Which I can't really reconstruct here. I wish I could. But I probably could if I worked hard enough on it. But basically the story was that you don't, it's going to end up being that you don't ever incorporate the preposition into a verb to begin with if that preposition has a complement. That's systematic, right? And this doesn't quite do that, right? So I admit that. But it only does it by virtue of perhaps a constraint of the following sort. It's going to be ultimately, the lack of anything there will be interpreted by simply pragmatics as meaning, it's got to mean Kramer, right? You're always going to go with, right? If he because what people do is they typically put shoes on themselves, right? And so that allows you to leave that off and you fill it in all on your own, right? So yeah, I don't really have that full thing worked out, obviously. But in any case, this is one standard approach within this theory to dealing with these things, and it has some virtues. One of which is that it's going to, right? So we did it stop moving? Oh, there we go. Put moves all the way up, of course, leaving on behind, and things cannot go before it because adjuncts, if you're going to put them on, are going to go to the right, no matter where you put them on in the structure. And there's probably some other constraint that you would want to put in there, but that's the general rule. The adjunct things that you might put on there in addition will go afterward. And then we get, standard kinds of evidence. We can, of course, float the both either right before the on or not, right? So you get it in exactly the slots that you would expect. And then we can do, for, why do I want this one? Verb plus, send out to the alumni. We can have send out the letters, the Kramer sent out the letters to the alumni. It'll work here too, right? Not really a problem. If we have the other one, we would have a structure like this. Sent the letters out to where it has just a perfectly viable semantics for the whole thing, using the structure that we need anyway, and we get the out being able to go. Right, and then we're also getting, because that slot can be occupied, then with this sort of to thing being a separate part of it, right? The alumni has to follow that other, the prepositional phrase to the alumni has to follow out. That's the result you want, because you cannot say Kramer sent the letters to the alumni out. It doesn't float anywhere. It stays in one slot. It stays in one slot because it's just doing what we see we do everywhere under this story for that slot, that meaning slot in the structure.